Okay, we're not. Great. I love to start a preschool with laughs. Some beautiful laughs. Okay, so following the school, yeah, we started. We're live, but good morning, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners. It looks like there's snow where you are, but there's not snow in Philly yet. But following the past 2 weeks where we had landmark free schools covering the history of liberalism, and last week a discussion about the US state. This week, we're going to discuss the ideological crisis of the state and the US state in the throes of that crisis. And we'll also examine or discuss John Rawls' theory of justice. And I'm going to let Dr. Montero take it away and start that discussion, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yes.
I feel like we're onto something.
Thank you, Emily. And it's good to see everybody, even though it's Thanksgiving weekend. But we had a beautiful time at Alice's house. And, everybody cooked something, and it was really nice, a nice Thanksgiving. So I want to thank Alice. And we met her mother, really. And Alice was so tense with her mother being around. And they look exactly alike. So, but I don't know what we would do if we didn't have this today. Because I agree with you, Emily, that we have to continue to follow this line of thinking because it carries a lot of significance in terms of the future of struggle and the future of the country. But you see how I look at it. The election evidenced more than the victory of Trump and a terrible defeat of the Democratic Party, which it was. It is evidence of a deepening, almost irreversible crisis of legitimacy, not just of politicians and the Democrats and Republicans, but of the state itself. By which I mean a crisis of what has come to be known as the liberal state, and we've kind of tried to unpack what that means in previous free schools. That is the state that comes into existence with the achievement of the bourgeois democratic revolutions going back to the 17th century, up into and including the 19th century, by the way, and the formation of the modern German state in 1871 as a result of Bismarck, known as the First Reich, which means the First Empire, Hitler being the Third Reich. I'm talking about, therefore, a crisis of the liberal state and all of its ideological accoutrement, neoliberalism, globalization, liberal ideology, postmodernism, the various institutions of the state, and the liberal rule of law and of the ruling elite. By crisis of legitimacy of the state, what we are talking about, and I'll try to tease this out a little bit, and certainly if you read carefully much of the commentary, especially in the New York Times these days, people like David Brooks, Ross Douthat, and others whose names I don't remember right now, you see them asking the same questions that we're asking. And when they ask these questions, it is not as though they're just talking as individuals. They are asking questions on behalf of the elite and their capacity to rule. But this crisis of legitimacy raises the question of, do the elites have the moral authority to rule in a society that is deeply unequal. Just on the election and some recent data from Philadelphia in particular shows that Trump made gains in 63 of the 66 wards in the city. The only wards where Harris went beyond Biden in 2020 was in 3 center city predominantly white wards, which is to say that most Philadelphians were, did not vote or voted for parties other than the Democratic Party, which, to put it mildly, is a severe blow. I don't think you guys can understand it unless you've lived in Philadelphia and have seen the mechanisms and functionings of a political machine, kind of only equaled by Chicago and maybe New York in the early 20th century. But this political machine not only got out the vote, but guaranteed a certain number of people would vote. Hence, for 35 years before 2016, before Trump barely took the state of Pennsylvania, no Republican had taken Pennsylvania. And certainly, Loren, nice to see you. We're just getting started. The extent of the defeat in Philadelphia is not yet clear. We don't yet have a total ward by ward, precinct by precinct count. We're mainly basing what we know of the vote upon exit polls, which are deeply imprecise. However, outside of the quantitative numbers, there is something qualitatively that happened. I think we have to pay close attention to this. The dissatisfaction of Black voters in Philadelphia with the Democratic Party, and by implication, Kamala Harris. If things turn out the way I think they will, and not only in Philadelphia, but Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, all of these big centers of Black populations, if the pattern, which I believe will reveal itself in Philadelphia, is also seen in Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Missouri, Atlanta, this will be seen and must be seen as a blow to the Democratic Party's narrative that they are the party that has taken up the mantle of civil rights and literally of Martin Luther King. If that claim and the narrative based upon it no longer has the support overwhelmingly of Black folk, it is a claim that the Democratic Party will have difficulty making, and hence part of the moral authority of the state and of the authority and rule of the ruling elite will have been taken from them. Let me put that again, because we have talked about this in Free School, where we argued that the Democratic Party is a party of white supremacy, which makes the claim hypocritically that they are the party of Martin Luther King and of civil rights. They've been able to make that claim because of the shameful, I would say, participation in self-identified civil rights leaders, that indeed the Democratic Party is just that. And that the Congressional Black Caucus being Black, this is another thing we're going to have to dig deeply into, is not only the defender ultimately of the civil rights movement, but of the legacy of Martin Luther King. And so this convergence of Black politicians and Black misleaders and Black quote, civil rights leaders, all being in the Democratic Party, has permitted the Democratic Party to make a claim which it cannot support on the basis of evidence that they are the party of the civil rights movement and of Martin Luther King. However, if the data about what happened on November 5th shows that huge numbers of Black people have abandoned the Democratic Party, it will be difficult for it to make that claim, for the state, the ruling elites, to make the claim that they rule in the spirit of the civil rights movement. And if they cannot make that claim, the crisis of legitimacy of the state is intensified. I hope everybody kind of understands. Does that make sense? A party that rules based upon a false claim that they do it based upon their embrace of the spirit of the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King. And I just wish to underline one thing. At the end of the day, the civil rights movement was a great moral movement. When King talked about a revolution of values, he was talking about establishing new moral foundations of government and the state. I'm going to return to that. This qualitative question has fought of whether or not the Democratic Party can claim the mantle of civil rights. And what have Black people said about that in this election is a big part of a lot of the discussion of what went wrong and why did Kamala Harris lose. You know, it's all over the place in newspapers, on mainstream media, and so on. But this election, and this is what is being discussed in all of these commentaries, especially in the New York Times, which I think probably has the best at this point. What they are addressing is a crisis of the state. And can the ruling elite continue to rule? And when we say a crisis of legitimacy of the state, what we are talking about is the crisis of the authority of the ruling elite. And they cannot rule without being seen as legitimate by the majority of people. So the state, after all, exists to guarantee a form of elite and class rule, of civilizational values, which I want to return to. I'll just say, which makes every state a civilization state, in spite of the fact that liberal bourgeois theorists would claim the opposite. However, in the throes of this crisis, there is a return by theorists, and I'll point out some of them, to the idea that the state can only rule if it has the authority of morality and of civilization. The state functions to uphold a certain form of capitalism. In this era, a neoliberal globalist form of capitalism dominated by the financial oligarchy. The state is the ultimate authority on everything from crime, good and evil, property, truth, morality, freedom. That is why the state consciously authorizes certain ideas and discourages others. For example, the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize for Literature, the different awards and prizes given out for scientific and other intellectual achievements. This is a way of authorizing certain thinkers and certain ideas. For example, I've written about Ibram Kendi, who has gotten every award you can imagine, and is at best a very mediocre person and thinker. But these awards were given to establish him as a great thinker on race. And you read his work, it is not good. What is that other award where they give you $500,000? The MacArthur Genius Award, yes. Well, MacArthur and Genius and $500,000. I mean, most academics would die for that because they're hustlers to start out with, believe me. All of this functions as a way of establishing the intellectual and moral authority of the state. One of the things we looked at the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics this year, and they were not even given to scientists, but to entrepreneurs and people, engineers involved in artificial intelligence. But this is all a way, again, of legitimizing certain ideas and establishing the moral authority of those who give these awards. The state, and this, I'm referencing the recent article by David Brooks in the New York Times. By the way, I highly recommend reading him, not because you want to find agreement with him, but to see the most sophisticated thinking of the elites. He says that the Trump movement wants to overturn the institutions of the society and of the state. He wishes to uphold these institutions, but to reform them. I'll return to this, but if you read David Brooks and others, they are talking about, in essence, what we would call the state of the whole people or the civilization state in theory. However, from the left and radical point of view, the theory of the state is pretty much Marxian. That doesn't mean Marxian without major revisions over recent history. Marx, Engels, and Lenin basically presented an alternative to what they call the idealist theory of the state, associated with the writings of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and maybe John Stuart Mills. The key works in the Marxist tradition are Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Philosophy of right means philosophy of the state, philosophy of citizenship. Engels' origins of the family, private property, and the state, and Lenin's state and revolution. These are foundational to the Marxist theory of the state. Marxists generally have not gone much further than those works in developing their theory. And they fundamentally see the state as a blunt instrument of class rule, and not in the ways that Kant and Hegel variously argued, that the state must be based upon values that are societal and civilizational, and that the state was not merely, or not essentially, a blunt instrument of force. If we use that definition, we cannot understand the modern American state, which is far more than that and far more sophisticated than that. The modern state, especially the modern US state, is far more complex, nuanced, and varied, consisting of networks, institutions, strategic individuals that plays a role not only to subdue classes that are not a part of the ruling class, but it functions, the state in order to rule must win the people. It must win the ideological battle. And therefore, anyone that thinks a revolutionary process is predicated upon the blunt force of a mass movement fail to understand that the state itself requires an ideological authority in society. And to overturn that authority, you must defeat them on the battlefield of ideas. There is no victory of revolutionary forces that is not preceded by victory of ideas of the opposing forces. For example, in this crisis, if we or people like us make the claim that the existing US state is neither legitimate nor does it have the moral or political authority to govern. If we make that claim, we have to show it, because their claim is indeed, as I've said with Martin Luther King or with the New Deal, we, the bourgeois state, the state of the elites, has refined itself based upon the traditions of the United States and has now become a state of the people. It is, and thus, this is why Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement are so very important to the state. By the way, you got a lot of people who, if the government is upholding Martin Luther King, is having a holiday for Martin Luther King, it must be something wrong with Martin Luther King. That's the wrong conclusion to draw. The proper conclusion is that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement were of such a magnitude that the state itself and the ruling elite could not live in American society without associating itself with the moral authority of Martin Luther King.
Right.
Our job is to reclaim it, not to abandon it, in the name of, let us say, postmodernism or gender theory or queer theory or whatever. This is why Baldwin is so important, and the year Baldwin has been so important, because Baldwin is a theorist of the civil rights movement, a biographer of the civil rights movement probably, helps to understand other thinkers and writers and other events of that period better by understanding Baldwin. The state employs vast numbers of people. I would estimate somewhere close to 20 million Americans work in one another way in bureaucracies and institutions of the state. The state, therefore, is not merely or solely a blunt instrument. Some would say it is ultimately that. I would argue perhaps not. And I'd like to make this point. I'd like to give an example when we get to Israel. I would say that today, that the intellectual and ideological functions of the state, and certainly as relates to the domestic governance of the society, are probably far more important than the blunt force police functions of the state. In other words, the ruling elite, I'm going to go a little faster, sorry for being so slow. The ruling elite, in order to rule in the modern sense of liberal rule, must be able to establish its moral authority. We rule not because we can repress you. We rule because we are capable and competent to rule, and we have the moral authority to do so. When we talk about the ideological and civilizational functions of the state, we're talking about all of those things involved with the spiritual, intellectual life of tens of millions, upwards of 300 million people. We're talking about universities, we're talking about intellectuals, we're talking about writers and artists and music and propaganda, and all of the means of mass communication to the people. Social media and mainstream media and pop culture and all of that function not in a vacuum. They exist and flourish to the extent that they do because they serve an ideological function to legitimize the ruling elite. For example, I was looking at a documentary on MSNBC yesterday, the day before, about the history of hip hop. And it was a promotion of hip hop. There was no critique, right. No attempt to connect it to what preceded it. I don't think. And the normal South Bronx, DJ Herb, and that early hip hop moment, and then the golden age of hip hop in the 1990s, and it awakened. The claim is that it awakened a generation, and I've heard a lot of people say that. With Public Enemy, I learned about Malcolm X, and but then, like Paul said, what is the price of the ticket? What else came with it? And it's always so interesting to me to see all these women commentators, academics about hip hop, who are so concerned about misogyny and homophobia and all of that in every other field. But when it comes to the discussion of hip hop, it gets, but anyway, and so I said, no, just because it became popular and many of those in it became very, very wealthy, up to including billionaires, one has to look at where it comes from and who is behind it. And this is when I started looking at a great composer, American composer by the name of Charles Mingus. Has anybody heard of him? Yeah, matter of fact, I proposed to Kathy that as we end the year of Baldwin, that we get prepared to do what we're going to do, a knowledge conference, but where we look at three of the greatest composers of the 20th century, Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, and John Rawls. And we look at them not just musicologically, but also from the standpoint of epistemology. And what does this music say to the people as opposed to pop culture and distraction of the people, especially the young generation? But none of this, especially now in the modern state, where the state manages or sees itself as managers of the spiritual and intellectual life of the people. By the spiritual life, I'm not just talking about religion, or not mainly about religion. I'm talking about all of those things involved with the ideological, artistic, aesthetic life world of people. If children never see beauty, if children never hear beauty, if the society never sees beauty, beautiful music, what does that do to people? And what does that say about a ruling class that makes available to children images and ideas that diminish the children's humanity and intellectual and spiritual development? Okay, let me when we talk about the ideological crisis of the state, we're specifically talking about the incapacity of elites to convince millions and millions of American people of their moral and ideological capacity to rule. That is where we're at. That is where we're at. The defeat of Kamala Harris was not her defeat primarily. She was just a player in something far larger than her. It is a defeat of the ruling elite who had assembled almost to a person in the Democratic Party and in the Kamala Harris campaign. $1.5 billion, never before seen in a presidential campaign. The whole media, for the most part, 24/7, propagating her as the savior of democracy, and on and on and on. The ruling class did everything they could to win this election and to win the people to their position, and they lost. So any discussion, well, Kamala didn't do this, she didn't communicate. No. The people had rejected the ruling elite. Now, part of the moral and ideological and civilizational authority of the state, again, we're not just talking about the government. I want to get to that in a minute, but of the state, that more permanent institution that tells us what is good, what is evil, what is beautiful, what is not, what is, I say, what is true and what is not true. When the people soundly reject their right and authority to tell us what is good, what is bad, what is truth, and so on, no matter how many experts from how many universities they throw at the people increasingly were rejecting them. The elite universities are no longer seen as unbiased institutions of truth, but are seen as corrupt and biased towards the ruling elite. I mean, it's unbelievable in a certain sense when I think about it. But every state has a origin myth. In the United States, you hear over and over again, the founding fathers. You know, I even hear Black people like Al Sharpton talking about the founding fathers. What fathers? And you don't have a founding father hometown, but that the US state came out of a revolution of anti-colonialism and freedom against the British Empire. That the revolutionaries of the late 18th century and their theorizing began the formation of a state, the essence of which is democratic, free, fair, and a marvel that all humanity can look to. We hear it over and over again. And that all of the institutions of the state are based upon those founding documents, let us say the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and especially the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that are known as the Bill of Rights. And then they would throw into that the Federalist Papers and various thinkers associated with the early founding of the US state. The founding fathers are seen, therefore, as heroes of civilization. That America civilized, and the American revolutionaries civilized this yet uncivilized territory, which is now the American nation and the American state. I can't emphasize enough that this origin myth, this myth of beginning, is a way of giving moral authority, and civilization authority. Now, I'll come back to this, but it brings with it all the blood and dirt of the bourgeoisie, including slavery, colonialism, genocide against Native Americans, and so on. So it is a difficult thing to claim civilizational and moral heroism of people that own slaves. You know what I'm saying? It's difficult. Now, they found a way by saying it over and over and over again and not having an alternative of any substance to oppose it. But they make that claim. So it's a very difficult claim, but it's a claim, it's interesting from a discourse point of view. It is a claim that they can make only if one assumes white supremacy. In other words, white people in the name of civilization had to do this. You see what I'm saying? But in the end, it served the greater good. And they would say to Black people, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you go back to Africa? And then I guess we said, well, why don't you go back to England? You know, if you want to say, but you know, it's all of that. Because what we have done, look at where humanity was, let us say, in 1492 as compared to where it is today. All of this is the result of the bourgeois revolutions and of white folk or Europeans. The other thing is, besides that or original myth, is also a theoretical forming of this originary myth, and that is the state of nature fiction. Most early political theory argues that before the state, humanity lived in a state of nature. The question is, what does the state of nature say about the nature of humanity, of man? For example, Thomas Hobbes and the British theorists said that the state of nature was a brutish, violent, dangerous place. That the state, as it were, is a way of protecting human beings and those within its purview from the state of nature, from what the anthropologists call barbarism. The French thinkers had a different view of the state of nature, hence a different view of human nature. The French theorists like Rousseau would argue that the state of nature was a peaceful, almost paradise, but it could only exist as long as people lived in communities where they would not develop beyond where they were. So the state of nature was good, but it was not sufficient for modern progress and development. Most American thinkers don't argue a state of nature, although by embracing, for instance, John Locke or Rousseau, they assume its existence. I think the state of nature argument gets a little dicey for Americans, given that perhaps there was a state of nature among Native Americans before you got here, and then you killed them and drove them off their land. So maybe you don't want to talk about the state of nature. But that's another question. Let me just quickly go through a number, because I think it is important to understand the philosophy and theory out of which so much of the thinking about the state and government up till today comes from. For example, the Anglo-American tradition, which reaches its apogee with John Locke and his treatise on government and property and happiness, are central. John Locke is the central thinker in the Anglo-American tradition of political theory. Locke is a bourgeois revolutionary thinker who believes that for the protection of property, of liberty, and of happiness, you need the proper government and the proper state. That is what he's saying. It's not complex, but it was revolutionary for that time. That the individual must be protected from both the church and the state. And the individual must be given the opportunity in a government, in a state, to pursue wealth, which is associated with happiness, and to do it without the interference of institutions like the state. Under feudalism, the church saw itself as having the authority to intervene in the lives of individuals. Locke said the church or no other institution should have the right to tell an individual what she or he should do or how they should live. The state should give people the opportunity to pursue their best interests. This is completely revolutionary in the history of political theorizing and moral theorizing in the European context. Okay? So one can understand this revolutionary rupture was profound, but it was preceded by an ideological struggle. And Locke was one of those great thinkers in this respect. But then continental Europe, especially the French, had another way of looking at things. And I often mention Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who saw man differently than the English did. And hence they talked about the general will. We've talked about this before. That society is organic, not just the aggregation of individuals whose rights must be protected by law and culture and morality. That's British. The British, I don't care where you go in philosophy of science, political theory, always defer to the individual more deeply than perhaps any other group, anywhere in the world. I think there's never been such a deep commitment to individualism as you would find in the Anglo-American tradition. So, but Rousseau and the French see society as organic in and of itself, not just the addition of individuals, but something organic. Therefore, the French would talk about the general will. The English would talk about the will of all. Does that make sense?
Is the British the same as the English?
Say that one more time.
Are the British the same as the English?
Yes. When we talk about the Anglo-American or the English tradition. And I would say that in this long history of ideas, the English have played a huge role. And that explains somewhat their arrogance. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I was curious about, what do you think is like the genesis of that ideology between like the British and the French? Like John obviously was like, man is good and then society corrupts man or whatever. I'm paraphrasing obviously. And then John Locke's like idea of political liberalism and like the idea of the community and stuff like that. Why do you think that those ideas in the Age of Enlightenment separated that way?
Ren, I can't right now answer that question, but that is a question that a lot of historians and philosophers have asked. Why does continental Europe differ? Because the Germans also would differ from the English on that point. I don't quite know the answer. I'm sorry to say it. But there is a difference, and Europeans are deeply aware of this. The English are deeply aware of their ethnic, civilizational, cultural difference from the continental Europeans. And in fact, the English see themselves as superior to continental Europe. Certainly in terms of the Industrial Revolution and colonialism and ideas, the British were way ahead of the Germans and the French. But yeah, that's a great question. I just can't answer it off the top. But however, in spite of Rousseau and the French, it was the Germans that made the greatest leap forward philosophically from the British theorizing. In particular, I always talk about Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Hegel. Each of them were passionate defenders of the French Revolution and the most revolutionary wing of the French Revolution. And Hegel supported, although it's denied, the Haitian Revolution and saw Toussaint as a man of destiny, not quite on the level that he saw Napoleon, but nonetheless a man of destiny, a man of history. Kant argues, basically what I've been saying, that the state must be a moral institution, that it cannot rule by abdicating any relationship or any position on the moral civilizational questions. Kant's last critique, Kant wrote 3 critiques: the critique of pure reason, the critique of judgment, which is about art, and the critique of practical reason, which is the moral question. And he said that that state authority must be moral authority, must be civilizational authority, and hence it must be based upon certain foundational values. For example, he would argue that all moral ethical decisions must be made from the standpoint of the golden rule: do unto others as you would want it done to you. And he would say, furthermore, the 10 commandments, very simple: thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie. You know, those 10 commandments lay a foundation for ethical decision making. So Kant, known as a structuralist in philosophy, and by structuralism, we mean that philosophical school which is concerned with the underlying or underpinning values that guide institutions. Okay? So Kant, again, I just want to point this out, sees the state as a moral and civilizational institution, not like John Locke, who saw the state as a protector of the rights of the individual, but not getting involved in the lives of individuals. Kant saw, and so for Locke, each individual in his or her self-interest would have to make a moral, ethical calculation about what he did or she does. Okay? That's a whole different thing from Kant. Hegel went beyond Kant, and this is where Hegel becomes very interesting, that the state is a function of the epoch in which it exists. In other words, the bourgeois state, the liberal state, is a reflection of an epoch where liberalism and bourgeois morality are central. Okay? That is why Hegel would see Napoleon as the man of destiny, as fulfilling and making manifest the objectives of the epoch, what he would call the zeitgeist, or other words, the spirit of the time. This is, again, ran wholly different from the English thinkers. You see what I'm saying? We're talking about organic relationships, that societies are totalities in and of themselves and not just an adding up of individuals who then try to manifest their own separate interests. Kant, Rousseau, Hegel would argue that society has an interest either in fulfilling history, this is Hegel, or in grounding moral and civilizational values. And this is parenthetically, you know, in the ways that Martin Luther King spoke, he was speaking more Hegelian than Lockean. I would say that most Black folk and most oppressed people, the anti-colonial struggle, would have tremendous problems with this individualism and deferring to the individual type of thing that is British thinking. Just again, the Marxists would say that the state never has legitimacy because it is a blunt force to protect the interests of the capitalist class. Hence, revolution is always the order of the day. Now, just parenthetically again, this gets the radicals and the revolutionaries in a problem. And this is where you see the various trends within the communist and revolutionary movements. For example, you take Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, that every struggle must in the end be a struggle for socialism. And people say, well, what about the struggle for democracy? What about the struggle for civil rights? Oh, these are just moments in a larger struggle. So one of the things, if you spend any time looking at podcasts, and I don't recommend it, I look at too many, but I'm fascinated always to see younger guys in particular who are talking about revolution. And it's always one thing, socialism. You get Richard Wolff, who is really not a good political economist in my opinion. He wants to always say that Marxism is about socialism and that alone. He's an anarchist, by the way, what we call an anarcho-syndicalist. But then you have the Trotskyists. But then those who are not anarcho-syndicalists or Trotskyists also make a profound mistake. But they're caught in a conundrum. If the state is always illegitimate, then what is the purpose of democratically reforming the state? You see what I'm saying? If the only task of revolutionaries is to overthrow the state, what about the many movements to reform the state in the meantime? For example, the two great moments in modern American history are the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement. And I'll come back to that. And that's why leftists have a problem understanding the Black question. I mean, and a lot of ways I don't, I blame them, yes, but I kind of understand what the problem is and how they're unable to resolve the problem, and how they end up being isolated from the great movements of the people who want change but have not yet decided whether they want to topple the state itself. Now, just the last point. We should always make a distinction between the state, literally the permanent, quote, government, the unelected government, those institutions which are more civilizational and moral than they are governing institutions. Governing is the day-to-day practice of managing the life world of a society. But government is not the state. Government derives from the state. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It derives from the state. We, in this English Anglo-American tradition, don't make this differentiation. And it causes great problems of understanding. People think, well, we've elected a president, and they assume that they've elected the ultimate authority. They say the president is the most powerful man in the world. Well, is he?
Right.
If we look at this recent thing with this, this war peace situation with Russia and the United States, the question is the president the most, well, is the president even governing, but government is not the state. It is the practice of rule, the practice of management for brief periods of society. But the state is permanent. Okay. Now, the most important treatise on the state and government was written about almost 60 years ago now by a man named John Rawls. It's called A Theory of Justice. It's a huge book, which most people, even experts and scholars, can't get through and don't need to get through. But he publishes it in 1971, and as I read, first of all, it is very Kantian. It's very Immanuel Kant. Start there. But he is asking the question, how and on what terms is the state stabilized, and on what terms does it promote social stability and the power of the elite, the ruling elite? And there are two events that are in the back of his mind. The New Deal in the 1930s, in other words, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Civil Rights Movement. He says the state should uphold values of freedom, equality, and fairness. He called the state a cooperative state. Others have called it a redistributive state. That the state must contribute to social economic equality. In other words, the state does not, in the Lockean sense, does not stand back and create conditions for each individual to do their thing. The state must be an active participant in I'll put the moral, spiritual, and civilizational development of society. The state must be an active force promoting equality and fairness and freedom. Okay? This is continental European thinking. It is Kant, not Locke. I find it quite interesting that the English theory of the bourgeois state had pretty much gone as far as it could go. By the time of the economic crisis, the Depression of the 1930s, and the the workers expressing their discontent with the corporations, and they wanted to organize. But I think more importantly is the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King raising the question that the state itself must be built upon moral foundations of equality, of an end to racial inequality, end to white supremacy. The more you listen to Martin Luther King, you see his deep understanding, and it's amazing how much he has been trivialized. King understood philosophy, and he understood Hegel, he understood Kant, and he understood Marx. He differed with the Marxian concept of the state. And there are many reasons for that. I don't wish to go into it now, but he did. He saw the state very much in Hegelian terms, that the state must represent the spirit of the time, the epoch, and it must change to adapt to that. Okay? And more than civil rights and Black rights, he was pushing for this larger project. So John Rawls is in certain ways continuing that discussion. By the way, with none of the eloquence and profundity of Martin Luther King. Okay. Now, just quickly, so much of the best writing in this period about the election and what it represents are coming from those thinkers that are looking at these questions in precisely this way, the way we're talking about them. Not this hysteria of the Black misleadership class or the Democratic Party functionaries and pollsters who got it all wrong and yada, 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 and what we're going to do now. But people who understand, and that's why I like to recommend the recent essay by David Brooks, but there's another one, a thinker who, one second, please, who, Daniel Chandler, who had an essay, "The Democrats Are in Trouble, This Man Can Save Them." And he's a scholar of John Rawls. And he feels that John Rawls' redistributive justice and what we've all talked about, this moral foundation of the state, can give the Democrats a narrative that can give them the basis to reestablish what they are as a party. But that would take decades, believe me. And one of the things he says, and I think David Brooks would agree with this, that these 45 years of neoliberal economics, which made the American society perhaps one of the most unequal societies in the history of man, who created a system of wealth and billionaire creation on the one side, and poverty, especially of children, of Black men, unseen in a modern society. And much of this was overseen by the Democratic Party and intellectuals and political forces affiliated to either that or the ideology, which is also the Republican Party. He is saying, and Brooks is saying the same thing, things went very badly 40 years ago. That 40-year run is over. The people themselves are rejecting it. And hence, we must return to the state as a moral actor, a moral arbiter, rather than hands off and let those who can get rich and the rest of y'all do the best you can. See, but then there's a problem, and this is the problem that Baldwin and Du Bois and King and others have addressed, and that is the problem of a white supremacist civilization. What do you mean, John Rawls, a civilizational state built upon a civilization anchored to white supremacy? This is Baldwin. This is the purpose of his oeuvre, of this great body of interrogation. You know, this is why so many people have gotten it so damn wrong with Baldwin. But it's always easy to reduce great Black thinkers to a characteristic of their personal lives, such as he's a queer writer. If that's all you see, you ain't seen Baldwin. You trivialized him. Baldwin is fundamentally talking about the very ideas that we are talking about. In fact, his methods, his epistemology can be extrapolated to our discussion of the state and make far more sense than John Rawls. Because what Baldwin asserts, that whiteness itself undermines civilization and democracy. There is no moral arbitration as long as whiteness is protected. And you know, we have gone through, and this is why, again, Plessy v. Ferguson.
Yep.
Whiteness is a protected category. So John Rawls, I mean, it sounds beautiful what you're saying. A cooperative state. That's a beautiful thing.
Right.
But how you get from where we're at to that, he don't even address, pardon me, he doesn't even address it. It's all more sluggish, but, and he can. But here's Du Bois, here's Baldwin. You know what I'm saying? Increasingly, Baldwin is saying the problem of Western civilization is the problem of whiteness. That the West cannot think cooperatively, cannot think morally, because of the blinders of whiteness and white supremacy. That is Baldwin. Baldwin must be examined on multiple levels, such as his epistemology. Epistemology, somebody asked me, what is epistemology? It is the theory of knowledge, the philosophy of knowledge. How do you go about knowing something? Baldwin is different than Locke. He's different than Kant. It's a different epistemology. But that is the conundrum that we face. How do you reestablish a civilizational state when the civilization is anchored to white supremacy? How can you have a moral foundation for the state? How do you repair the ruin and damage done to this society by neoliberalism without confronting the question of whiteness and white supremacy? You can't do it. My last point, just on international law. The International Criminal Court issued warrants for the arrest of Netanyahu. The Biden administration wanted Netanyahu to slow down on the genocide. Don't stop it, slow it down. Why? Because while the United States had put forward this concept of a rules-based international system, a law-based international system based upon American liberal values, etc., which presumably would have given a authority of the West to govern the rest of the world. And a lot of people in the rest of the world accepted this, you know, especially if you paid them and gave their children scholarships to Harvard, you know what I'm saying? And let them steal as much as they could from your country. From their country. So, you know, you could play into that because, again, this rules-based or law-based international system was a way of the United States and the West saying, we do not rule as the British did by blunt force, by suppression of anti-colonial movements, but we want to establish a system based upon rules and law where all nations are treated equally. But then here comes Israel and the genocide in Gaza, where the United States voted time and again against a ceasefire in Gaza and sent the most lethal weapons to the Israelis to be used against civilians, in particular women and children. Which brings to the fore the very conundrum of what Baldwin brings up. How can a civilization state or a world order dominated by the West be based upon whiteness and white supremacy? It will always lead to what we're seeing in Gaza, which then establishes that the West does not have the moral legitimacy to rule and to govern. Hence, the rise of all of these alternatives, the Russia-China alliance, the Russia-China-North Korea-Iran alliance, BRICS, etc., as alternatives and as challenges to the moral authority of the West. Does that make sense? Putin as a reasonable leader, Biden and Trump as irrational and out of control and only interested in the power of the Western countries. Whereas Xi Jinping, Belt and Road, a cooperative win-win alliance, and the West as trying to impose its will through force. 800 military bases. Well, China got about 3 outside of China. United States said, well, if you're interested in a moral authority, why you got 800 military bases?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, in real fact, Du Bois's statement at the beginning of the 20th century that the problem of the 20th century is the color line, or race and whiteness, is now the problem that is coming back to bite the West in its behind. It is what you are. It is your moral and ideological standard that the world rejects. And finally, as this election, I think, will prove more as we get more data, that this was a rejection of the moral authority of the ruling elite. It thus creates a crisis of the state. And finally, a crisis of the ideology of the state. We are therefore in the throes of one of the great ideological moments, ideological struggles of modern history. And it is that we must prepare ourselves to conduct and be a part of. And Frank, I'll just say this, and not be dissuaded by those who cannot see what we see. We do this every week, so it makes it easier for us. But all of the postmodern theory, I think it's in the dustbin of history already. And that's what the writers are saying. All of these writers, David Brooks, Ross Douthat, and so many others are saying that we got to rethink this thing before we lose it all. The people are rejecting our moral authority, and that's more important than the authority of force. You can make people fear you, but the point, if you wish to govern or rule, is to win people to you. And they've lost the American people. I think it's now irreversible. I think the loss of Black people in this election, and even though they always preface it, some Black people, it ain't some. The trend is very clear.
Right.
Most of us, especially the poor and working people, have rejected on moral terms the rule of this elite. Philadelphia is a prime place. Sherelle Parker, get ready for one term, girlfriend. The first thing you do when you come into office is talk about building a stadium for the 76ers. When most people can't afford their groceries or their rent,
Mhm.
And who going to pay? It's going to be our taxes. So that's your priority. But that's what the people rejected as well. So I'll stop there. Go ahead, Annalise, for 6
Maybe I should say something.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, one of the I just really appreciate this because I did read that essay you're talking about, the
Mhm.
one by,
Handsome.
the one that talks
Chandler.
Chandler,
Daniel
the
Chandler.
one that talks about John Rawls.
Mhm.
Honestly, I couldn't get a lot out of that
I can
essay about John Rawls because it just gives like the basic things that John Rawls would say. And it sounds like, oh yeah, these are good ideas, but what do they look like in practice? So
Mhm.
I think what you went to, and I also had this thought of, remember that time when in free school we read that essay, This Far and No Further, where Baldwin is dealing with the question of the relationship of the state to the individuals in society, but he sees it as a two-way interaction, where he says that society gets its moral authority from the state, but then the state is also shaped by people in society basically standing up for what they believe, the moral
Yes.
values society should be organized on. And I couldn't help but thinking the same thing that you were saying is in this moment when so many people, and it's good that they are asking the right kind of questions because there is a crisis that will have to be averted. But they never go to King, they never go to Baldwin. Even John Rawls, like this idea of I read this up, the original position, which is that, oh, you can figure out what the best or the most just society can be by doing a thought experiment, right? Where you remove everything about your identity, your race, your religion, you strip yourself of all of that, and then ask yourself the question, what would be the most just thing that would make sense in this situation? But that's the question is, I don't know, again, going back to what you were saying, I don't know how you can ever do it if in its conception, the state encodes certain white supremacist principles. How do you strip yourself off of that to then answer the question of justice and delivering justice?
Absolutely. See, that's the big conundrum.
Yeah.
And that's why Baldwin is so vital and so important in this moment, in this ideological situation.
Right.
Mhm.
And the last thing I'll say is when you were talking about how much this is a question of moral authority,
Yeah.
more than just like, oh, like we just change the narrative a little and it'll work next election.
Mhm.
But whether the ruling elite can rule, whether the people take them seriously to have legitimacy, to set down the rule of law. It again reminded me of something we've like discussed in free school. You know how they piled all these convictions on Trump, or not convictions, indicted him for these many counts. And there was this other article that I can talk a little bit about, which basically talks about how if not even 1 in 1,000 Americans would be able to tell you exactly what he was being charged with. And I think that's true. And the reason I think that's true is I tried and I still couldn't understand why you needed 34. But the outcome of the election basically says that even if, according to the ruling elite, these were the laws that Trump violated, they don't care. They don't care about what the ruling elite is saying with authority is criminal or like a immoral kind of person to be in society, but especially in politics. They're like, no, none of that. And that to me, again, goes back to this question of the ruling elite really having lost its authority, both moral authority, but then also the authority to set down what is going to be considered as law or what is going to be considered as the right way to.
There's no question.
Yeah.
And that's actually what all of these articles of David Brooks's and all of them are really trying to get at. This was a rejection. And they see this Trump movement as a rejection of the moral authority of the ruling elite. And that is deeper than just another election. Well, go ahead, Samir. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask a question actually, which was, who was the philosopher that came up with the social contract? Was it Dean? Was it Locke?
Well, it comes out of the French tradition, Rousseau and those, that the state must enter into a moral contract with the people. The government must enter into moral contract, and that theory of a social contract has had greater impact, for example, in the Chinese Revolution, in the Indian independence movement, and most of the African independence movement. You know, the revolutionaries come with the idea of a social contract, not individual rights type of thing. Yeah.
I just think it's interesting, with the talk about the election and how people felt like the state wasn't working in their favor. Exactly like you said, it was a neoliberal state that left people, individuals, up to their devices to loot, to make money. But so many people feel left behind. And I don't know, I just wanted to point out,
Yes.
the left behind feeling
Yes.
of so many
Yes.
people.
Or the betrayed feeling, the
Yeah.
lied to feeling.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. And I'm sort of thinking about what you said about Americans' view of other countries like Putin, like Xi Jinping, and how you can't make this argument anymore now that Trump is in office. Oh, well, Putin is irrational. This is the argument I hear very often. Putin is irrational. Wasn't Donald Trump irrational? Like, everybody admits nobody can know what he's going to do next. Or, Xi Jinping, he's just a dictator. His people don't support him. Well, how can you say people support Joe Biden? Or how can you say people support Donald Trump? So it's just, it'll be a very interesting next 4 years.
Yeah.
Because those arguments can't be made.
Yeah. And you're right. And they can, and this is why the crisis is deeper than either Kamala or Trump, because it is a question of the state and the authority of the elite to rule, not just to govern, but to rule, to establish what is right and what is wrong, what is truth, what is a falsehood, what is beautiful, what is not beautiful, what is art, what is music, in fact, if you think about it, all of these things they have imposed upon us. I do not feel comfortable with a diminution of the great music of the African American people and constantly promoting to children and young people the idea that hip hop somehow surpasses Duke Ellington. I mean, come on. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What you were saying just reminded me. I wasn't even thinking about this, but there was that banana art piece.
Oh, yeah.
That the billionaire bought, and then he ate it.
Oh my God.
And it was $6 million. And when it was first displayed, it was just a banana with some duct tape on a wall. That was the art piece. And people were like, well, what does this mean? And why is that worth $6 million? And then the millionaire buys it and then eats it. And he basically confirms to everybody it did mean nothing. And that's the problem with postmodernism and other modern ideologies, is that they are devoid of meaning, or they default to nihilism, that there is no meaning. And I think that's the problem with hip hop too. I think nihilism is huge in hip hop, especially young men. And yeah, I think that's the problem, is that the art is devoid of meaning, and it is the meaning. And I think that the people will reject art that doesn't have meaning. I think we're witnessing that.
Well, that's what Kathy wrote about with Basquiat and Jacob Lawrence, which was, I thought very important. But yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think your introduction to this, it makes me think about, when we talk about the question of the liberal state and this theory, I'm thinking that this also, like what is really hyped is a really incomplete idea of human nature. And I think, what you're talking about, the whole, I mean, I was looking up the article you were talking about, and this,
Which one is this?
the man who saved them, the Democrat.
Oh, yeah.
The one on John
Chandler,
Rawls.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and this idea of, the veil of ignorance that they rely on, which is, it's commonly seen as, the idea of justice that's blind and so on.
Mhm.
I was thinking that this ultimately, it comes from a place where you see human nature. Firstly, you see human nature as static. You see it, not in move,
As,
as static. That's something that's fixed.
oh, yeah,
And
yes,
doesn't-
static, I'm sorry.
like doesn't change in time, and also that it's fundamentally it's negative. That that's why this whole question of
Absolutely.
fairness and so on and so forth comes in.
Mhm.
But the thing is,
Mhm.
I mean, I was bringing this up because of what you were saying as the question of the original myth coming out of the anti-colonial movement of the first American Revolution, which is responsible for which gave legitimacy to the liberal state to begin with. So this comes out of the revolutionary movement of the time,
Mhm.
and which leads to the formation of a state which does not see, which only sees human nature as ultimately something that's to be controlled,
Mhm.
and which essentially it's not possible to change, and human nature is ultimately ultimately it's unfair. So the only way you can be fair, or the only way you can think about justice is is if you put yourself out of the equation. And this is so vastly, it's the polar opposite of what every revolutionary anywhere in the world has been talking about. The question of every revolutionary has had faith in human nature, and the fact that you can human nature can be changed if you have faith in human nature and if you act on what you consider to be true. And I was thinking that this seems to be a crucial difference between the state that comes out of the first American Revolution and the modern states that arise out of the anti-colonial movement of the last century, which
Yes.
which sees which
Mhm.
precisely has had to face this question
Mhm.
that human nature is ultimately human nature is not the same as whiteness defines it to be, which is I think this is this sort of this clarifies something for me, because um to see the what you were bringing up, to see the first American Revolution as giving legitimacy to the liberal state, this is useful because it shows this question of the human nature. But if you don't see the human nature, the fact that human nature is seen as fixed and essentially negative, if you don't see that, then it leads to the whole the ultra left claim again about talking about delegitimizing the entire revolutionary process of America. And I think this distinction is very important, and in this time when the future is up for grabs, as all of these thinkers are talking about. Because I think along with the liberal state, the question of the human nature is also once more on the table, where people are trying to decide. Okay, people are trying to firstly face the question that whatever we have considered to be morally legitimate, or has been legitimized by the Democratic Party and the state in the last few decades, all of that is in question. And therefore, what's the nature, what really is the potential of the human nature today? What are we faced with? And yeah, I think this is precisely why Baldwin is indispensable, because when even in that the John Rawls article, they're talking about this question of they're talking about the question of uh, just losing my train of thought. Yeah, so the question of equality and so on. And I think this writer, he makes the claim that John Rawls' solution to to inequality was not simply greater equality, but something about, like something about to be biased towards the least advantage, that sort of thing he's saying. But this is where Baldwin offers a fundamentally different answer, because he's saying that ultimately there is nothing, like his idea of the human, his idea of the individual is at odds with this framework, with the liberal framework, that ultimately respect and like dignity is something, it's not something to be given to people. And what Baldwin is arguing is that this is the way for the way toward dignity is always there in the people, and what you are talking about is ultimately a challenge of what the role of the individual, like what the possibilities of the individual are and what the role of the state is. Because yeah, this is a different answer about human nature, because it's not I don't think Baldwin is saying that human nature is essentially positive either. He's saying that it's in movement.
Yeah.
You have the positive and the negative. And he's talking, that's why he's talking about the moral choice and so on. But I wanted to bring this up because, like the question of the state and the individual, I think it seems that they're very related. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say what Rawls, that's his position is, it treats the nature or the human nature as a negative. I don't know if I fully understand, because that's not, I mean, I find it interesting because I feel like I might have missed something. I didn't get the sense that he was saying it was essentially negative. He was saying the things that are superimposed on it, like this idea of your identity or religion or ethnicity, all of that, like in some ways the history. I think that's how I'd like to put it. Human nature might have some universal quality shared by all people who can make this decision about what is just and what is not. But then people have different histories, or they're constituted differently through a historical process. And he says you can put that aside and then try and see what would be just to the broadest. But then I understand the point you're saying is, because I also have that question, is can you separate historical constitution from that question? I mean, there is a reason why we talk about a Black imaginary, because Black people are a historically constituted people. That historical process is important for their epistemology, for their understanding of what is just and what is not. So, the bottom line is I end up agreeing with you, but I don't think it's a question of human nature per se.
Well, I think
I think Rawls is sophisticated enough not to go there. But you're right about Locke. Locke believed that human nature outside of society had the capacity to be violent and all of these negative things. But I don't think that Rousseau and those would have. I think Kant was more of a rationalist, which gets closer to what your thing on Baldwin is, that human beings through reason could remake themselves, and that the ethical, moral choices is a way of human beings deciding who they will become. I think that's more Kantian. I think the English are far more pared down and a more negative thing about humanity.
I have I guess I've been trying to think about why your presentation was really focused on more like a moral contract.
Yes. Yes.
Versus like a social contract.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess where I'm going with that is because I feel like the leap that Martin Luther King Jr. made was that a social contract might just be what the state provides for people, but I think the leap that the civil rights movement added to that was would Americans be okay with a state that provides what they need, but at the expense of other people. And I think that's like the question of like slavery, or the question
Yes.
of like colonialism, or imperialism, I guess. So with that in mind, I guess I'm trying to think like at this moment, I know like the ruling class has lost like moral authority.
Yeah.
I feel like I could say primarily because of its betrayal of the American people. But I guess you can't ignore Palestine either. I think that's one of the big reasons why like the Democratic Party lost. But I guess in like the remaking of a state,
Mhm.
a moral, I don't know, I'm kind of lost actually.
I
Wait, let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, I hear, you asked the question, why did I emphasize the moral authority as opposed to the social contract theory? This is a very good question. The French did think that if the state establishes a social contract between itself and the people, that governing would be governing by the will of the people. No, you don't. It doesn't mean necessarily writing down every plank in the social contract. But for the Americans, the U.S. Constitution is that contract between the governed and the government, as it were. But this is why I think modern and postmodern, and definitely English theorizing, does not include a discussion of civilization or the moral foundation. That is in Kant and Hegel. It's not even in the French Rousseau and those, I don't think. But I think the reason I emphasize it so much is because I think the crisis is a moral crisis. The ideological crisis of the state is a moral crisis of the state. On what grounds? This is what I felt about the election. You could almost hear it if you paid attention. It was not just the economy stupid. It was, I mean, I think we all felt it was much more than that. It was a deeper questioning of, because that's why they didn't even pay attention to all of these lawsuits against Trump, because they said, well, who are you to bring charges? I mean, like, y'all are morally pure or whatever. I think they realize, a lot of people realize, I should say, that the ideological crisis of the state is the moral crisis of, can the elite rule? And I think the moral connection is broken because people feel that the government and those that rule have lied to us, have impoverished us. I think this is, you all have, I mean, look here in Philadelphia. I mean, all this poverty, you're going to talk about a basketball stadium and the community where it's to be built, they done told you they don't want it, And so you get these black misleaders, going on talking about, well, why are you going to go along with the Chinese? Well, why should I go along with you? You understand what I'm saying? To turn it into, I don't know what the fuck they're doing, but it's just, it's low and decadent, the way they carry themselves and the way they go about this. So I think it is the moral question. But let me let Ren come in, and then Eddie.
I agree. I think it's a moral questioning. I think it's really interesting when we talk about the veil of ignorance, because it always makes me think, like, how much does it take to unveil, to like unshroud the veil of ignorance? Because I feel like as a Black person, I don't have the privilege of being ignorant. I've never had the privilege of being ignorant. So when we talk about the veil of ignorance, and then we address Black people, and then I think it's always Black people, not first in the sense like we're in the lead, but we are at the bottom of the totem pole. So there has never been this veil of ignorance. And then there's this otherness that people feel as though because Black culture is so Black culture is so instrumental in American society that it almost becomes this critique. Like you critiquing hip hop as a Black person is one thing. Other people critiquing hip hop as a medium or as an art form is a completely different other thing.
Do you think I'm unjustified in my critique of it?
Yeah, I think at the precipice of when hip hop was forming and like your kind of like idea of it, definitely so, because I don't have that kind of vantage point to look at hip hop that way, especially in the society that we're in currently. But do I think hip hop is in totality bad? No. Do I think people outside of our culture should be critiquing hip hop? Absolutely not. But then taking hip hop as that kind of vehicle, I think with Cheryl Ralph, they kind of put Black people in these figure-headed spots. So they're like open to this critique, like, oh, Cheryl Ralph went to the 76ers here. Black people want the Sixers here. It's Black people aren't a monolith in that kind of way. And I think the election has shown that. And I think it's very interesting when we talk about these theories of James Baldwin and Martin Luther King and like all these other people, but it's important to not think about Black people as a theory. There are currently like Black people in Philadelphia, there are currently Black people all over the world who are preaching these ideas, not just in the way of Martin Luther King said this, or James Baldwin said this. Black people have current ideas now that we should be listening to. Obviously, read James Baldwin, read Martin Luther King, read Du Bois and all those people because they have amazing ideas. But I think that a lot of people get caught up in the previous theories that have come before us, especially non-Black people, like reading them like, oh, he was so thoughtful, why weren't people listening? Because are you listening to the Black people who are in front of you right now? Then like you're kind of repeating the ideas and like things like that, critiquing what's coming out of the Black community. I think we have to really understand that Black people are not a monolith and like to understand their ideas as people before they
I agree with you completely. You know, Black people in the throes of a profound ideological crisis. And sometimes I feel that the Black misleadership class is more ruthless and brutal in relationship to other Black thinkers. Their views that just don't get a chance to be heard. And, you know, my critique of hip hop is I always ask, well, who's behind this? I mean, you know, the great, like I talk about Charles Mingus or John Coltrane or Ellington. How does, let us say, you know, Drake, as an example. How do you become a multimillionaire? What is that? If money is a way of evaluating art, well, why are you a millionaire and these other people died penniless? You know, there's something going on here that is beyond Black folk, I think, and I think it's a part of this ideological struggle. We can get back to it. But I want to know, you know, so you said, why you go back to King? Why you going back to Baldwin? You know what I'm saying? I'm saying, but who you want me to talk about today? Now, I know a person say, well, Bell Hooks. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. Now Baldwin, though. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm not saying don't go back to that.
No, I understand. But I'm one, honestly, I really try to understand the whole canopy of or kaleidoscope of Black ideas. That's the story of my life, by the way, and write about it and, you know, all of these types of things. But I think, I could tell you my methodology. You know, see, I go back to that great period of revolutionary struggle, the ideas, the art, the music that comes out of it. I think revolution produces the best. It produced the best of us. And since then, the ruling class not only tried to appropriate the civil rights movement and came, but tried to contain and have, in a lot of ways, contain the Black movement. But I think we can't afford not to enter into critique. I don't think that hip hop is a Black thing.
You don't think at the genesis of hip hop that it's a
At its genesis.
Yes.
But it quickly became an instrument of.
For sure. That's because, I mean, you could say that about a lot of things that started off Black. And that's what I'm saying in the beginning of my.
But let me ask you this, but becoming anti-Black.
Yeah, I think exactly. When you put not just like Cheryl Brown, but there are people in media and like art and artistic forms that are not placed in the Black community, because they are Black people, like of skin, of race, of ethnic group, and they're placed to be agents of chaos inside of the Black community. But I think when other people begin critiquing those people outside, and I don't think anything's above hip hop, above critique. I don't think anything in hip hop or as an art form is above critique. Everything should be critiqued if it's being produced, and it's going to be regardless of what I say or what anybody says. But I'm saying if it's coming from Black people and we're focused on critiquing the Black community and what's coming out of the Black community, that is as a result of white supremacy. And why white supremacy is using Black people to place them in media forums or in political spaces or in literature spaces and producing these kind of things that are not objectively of the Black community and kind of being stripped away and pulled and like being absorbed by that.
That's not the question, then. What is of the Black community?
And who's going to say that, though?
Yeah,
it has to be us inside the Black community.
Well, us, and I agree with you. It's just like I critique Locke.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's English and I'm not English. You know what I'm saying? I think I agree with you. Good faith critique. The whole critique is because critique is the word meaning investigation, really. Because we want to know. I'm telling you, and this, I don't want to make a big thing of me, but my whole life has been involved in ideas. Not only ideas, but ideas. And I'm not nobody famous. I'm just a regular guy out here. But I've always wanted to know not just the surface, but the depth and depth. Something happened with the defeat of the civil rights movement. We've experienced something. I'm telling you, man, we could talk about it more. But how you go from a love supreme to bitches and hoes? And you're only talking about Black women. If you was equal opportunity, you ain't never called no white woman a bitch and a hoe. You better not. But you turn that violent rhetoric towards us. Okay, we're not a perfect people, but our art ain't never manifested no performance like that. Why?
You don't think that's orchestrated?
Yes,
I'm saying
that's my point.
Yeah, like it's completely orchestrated.
And so the critique of it can be from many sides.
I agree. It should be from many sides, but I think that there's too many people there's too many chefs in one kitchen. I don't think that everybody needs to critique Black culture. I think Black culture is Black culture. If we want to dive into other people's culture and critique it that way, we can come up with the same ideologies, the same amount of critique.
I wouldn't be so defensive about it.
Oh, no, I'm not being defensive.
I don't think, but I hear what you say. But see, my thing would be like this. I think hip hop is a social, cultural phenomenon in American society that in a lot of ways has shaped at least young people in American society. For instance, I know Jeremiah, who's not here today. He said, I'm from Houston. I was brought up in a Korean community. I didn't know any Black people. I thought hip hop was my way of getting to know Black folk. You know what I'm saying? And so I would say he has a right to critique it from the standpoint that it came to him. I wouldn't feel too bad about that. I understand. And I understand also that, too often we are unjustly criticized, which is different than critique, by the way.
for sure.
I understand that. But everybody that has something to say about these phenomenon are not coming from an anti-Black point of view.
I agree.
And I think collectives like this, all of us working and thinking together, there's no substitute for it. You know what I'm saying?
I agree.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I feel like I agree with Renan in the sense that Black culture is Black culture and the voices of the critique need to come from Black people.
Mhm.
And I think the question becomes, why are we so comfortable with questioning and criticizing and critiquing Black American culture when we don't do that same thing for every culture? Because
What makes you think we don't?
because we don't. We don't sit and talk about, I'm Ethiopian. We do not have an open conversation about Ethiopians eating raw meat and critiquing that portion of my culture. If we did, then I'd be like, it's fair. But because Black American culture is so greedily consumed by the globe, it feels like it's something that's for everybody.
And because
But it's not.
because it's a billionaire industry.
It became an industry,
Yeah.
but the root of it is a cultural root.
Well,
It's
yes,
not a
yes and no.
But
Anything can be appropriated to become the opposite of what it started as.
yeah, so it can be appropriated. But if I want to hear a genuine critique and feel like, oh yeah, that was a really valid point that you just made about this artist, this song, this portion of Black culture, I don't want to hear that from anybody else because you don't have the cultural relevance to it.
Mhm.
I'm Ethiopian American. I don't have the cultural root to be like X, Y, and Z about the 90s hip hop, about Tupac and Biggie. I don't have that cultural basis in my family.
Mhm.
So my critique of it is not rooted in anything other than what I've read and consumed. It's not something that my mom played growing up. It's not something that my dad listened to. That goes for the same thing if Emily decided that all of a sudden she's like the head of Black culture. I'd be like, Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. But even Renan, you grew up Haitian and Nigerian. Our experience is different.
Now
with Black
we have Nigerians, we have Haitians, and even some Ethiopians that are heads of Black studies programs around the country. So
but they're looking at it from an academic perspective rather
Yeah.
than from a cultural, like I know this because I'm experiencing
well, take
it.
what's his name, the rapper that was killed out in LA. He was Ethiopian.
Nipsey Hussle.
Mm.
Nipsey,
Hussle.
yeah.
Nipsey Hussle.
Yeah.
But he was Ethiopian.
He was Ethiopian, but he's not the person that can say in the 80s Black music was X, Y, and Z.
Maybe he can.
But how can he?
Maybe he.
His family emigrated here.
Yeah, but he. Okay.
It's not
Look,
the
we
same.
won't, let's
is what
not
I'm saying.
argue this point too often,
We
too
don't need
much.
diaspora.
But yeah,
I'm just saying, the root of it has to come
my
from African
father's from the
American.
Cape Verde Islands.
Okay.
I don't identify as Cape Verdean as much. I'm African
But
American.
would you sit there and talk about Cape Verdean culture and critique it widely with a bunch of people who are not Cape Verdean or have Cape Verdean roots?
Yeah, I'm not
You would?
happy with the Cape Verdeans.
The culture, not the
Would you think
politics.
something would come of merit of that?
Nothing.
We'll come back to that. Who can critique what and what is critique?
Everybody can say whatever they want.
Yeah, but see,
I'm just
but
saying it's
why?
not a merit.
But Ren, let's understand. Critique is investigation,
I agree. I think everyone
and
should
so I don't think, and especially at this time, when so much has been signed, you go into Black studies academic environments, they beat the drums for hip hop day and night. I said, but have you ever heard of Charlie Mingus? No, who is that?
for sure.
No. But yes, but then those are the people that are going to go out and teach in public schools.
Mhm.
Like my son said to me, hip hop is the greatest music we ever produced. I said, are you on drugs? How could you say something like that? This is a fad, a popular, but I don't want to stay on this point too much because what we want to look at is the crisis of the state. And a state in crisis will throw whatever they can muster at the people. I feel that the Blackness leadership class, the Black political class has betrayed Black people. And for example, it is not just only Black people that can say that. Anybody has an idea of what preceded it. They have a right to say it.
I agree.
You know, they do. We are not, because we are a world constituted people, African Americans. Some of you Nigerian and Haitian, I think a Nigerian would have a more difficult time understanding Black history than a person who was Chinese that grew up in the United States.
And I agree with you.
Yeah, you know,
I think
and,
that was
I'm not saying anything bad against
No,
Ethiopians
we
or
agree. That's the
Nigerians.
point. Like,
you know?
I don't think if I specifically, as a Haitian American, I mean, my parents immigrated here. My dad was 17. My mom was 4. They can't tell you about Black culture, and I don't expect them to get up and start talking about it because they don't know what they're talking about. In the same way, I don't expect anybody who is not a Black American to be able to talk about it as well. My parents could get up and do it, but who are they? And or is what they're saying coming from merit? Probably not.
But maybe that because they never felt the need to study it.
For sure, and they
You
don't.
know, and they got here trying to make a way and
Yeah.
for y'all and all that kind of thing. So they just accepted the basic principle. I mean, I know with my own Cape Verdean son, they've always had a problem with being Black.
For sure.
You know, they probably Ethiopians the same. We don't want to be Haitians, and
Yeah, for sure.
you know, and so. But I just say that to say it is. Yes, it is the experience, the phenomena that we've experienced, and I could say, well, man, you ain't experienced this, you know, but I wouldn't.
No, but the point is,
I mean, even though you Black,
yeah,
even though you're physically Black,
Our experiences are different.
yeah.
because
And
Black is not a
but then
monolith.
again, I believe that you all will easily, just like all these people here, learn this experience. Martin Luther King don't just belong to us.
No, and I don't think that Black history or Black politics
And so
is just for Black people.
Mhm.
I think specifically portions of Black culture are for Black people. So that's the only thing I think that
I
Black
think we
people
should just
can
be
get.
careful with it.
Yeah,
That's it.
with everything,
Yeah,
man,
for
with
sure.
everything. But we must go forward.
Yeah.
And we must listen to what I'm saying. And we must think. We have no. We as a people, that great revolutionary moment, and it was that. We've experienced a great setback. We have. I'm telling you, don't know. Sometimes you wonder how we going to get over this hump, man. We produce all this greatness. Now we're if you think Al Sharpton is a civil rights leader, no. And I can prove it to you, not just because he's a hustler and all of that, but Martin Luther King and them said you can't separate civil rights from peace. You can't separate civil rights from poverty. I don't think they can do it. You know, that's not civil rights, that's a fraud. But that's maybe some last ones.
So can I say something just to offer a perspective, because we're talking about who can speak to certain things. First of all, I didn't grow up, right? I didn't grow up with King. I didn't grow up with Baldwin. They all came to me much later in my life and coincided with me coming to this country for obvious reasons. Because in India, I think there was a time when the Black freedom struggle was studied, it was reported, and it was in people's consciousness. But then, like in the United States, like among Black people, there was also a counter-revolution in India among the intellectuals, which sort of put this aside and moved on to what we thought would be the new idea of freedom movements and so on and so forth. And what you were saying about Jeremiah and his experience, I mean, hip hop is in India right now, and I have to look at what, there was an Indian traditional way of thinking about the criteria of art and culture. And it was very much in connection with Afro-America. I mean, those great musicians who went to India, Coltrane, the Coltranes, John and Alice Coltrane, that connection. At one point, Paul Robeson was famous all over India, and that represented a different thing than hip-hop being accepted into India represents today. What Paul Robeson, every person, the song We Shall Overcome, translated in 12 Indian languages. I grew up thinking it was an Indian song in Hindi or Bengali, but that's the thing, what that represented, I think, was that the Black struggle and Black people are a world historic, revolutionary people. And their struggle had significance. Their culture or the cultural renaissance that came with the revolution had huge significance for the whole world. And that's why Paul Robeson was a household name in India for the longest time. The opposite, I feel the opposite now that I see that Indian music in some ways has Indianized hip hop, but that's the basis of how they see Black people. They see they think that this to them represents what Black culture, what Black society looks like. And I do think that there is something to be said about critiquing that, because how did we go from Paul Robeson to that being the marker of what Black culture should be to an Indian person in India who might not be able to ever come to America and actually study these things like I have the opportunity to have done. And the other thing is, I do agree with what you were bringing up, Ren, about this thing about reading Baldwin. Like, it can't just be that, oh, we are going to say there was a Baldwin, there was a king, and we should read them, and that would be the end of it. But that is also why in free school, that's not all we do. Everywhere, like free school from its conception has been in Black churches, right? We do public events, and the whole point is to have a dialogue with the people, not to read or theorize in vacuum. And that's a very important part of our practice. So I do agree that it has to be supplemented with actually getting to know the people. But I guess the reason why we feel rooted in thinkers like Baldwin, Du Bois, and King is that the framework of how you go to the people is as important as going to the people. Or like Doc, that phrase that we used to say, or you brought up, the message and the messenger. It's not just the message, but also the messenger. And so I just wanted to say that, because obviously all of this is very important for me to understand what is going to be my place in all of this.
And I think I want to just get back to the theory of the state and the crisis of the state. We can't, however we deal with this, who can critique what and how. But I think this crisis that we're facing is so huge. I mean, it is deeply existential for the society. But go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, related to what you're saying about the crisis of the state, and what Nathan was highlighting, is a moral crisis of the state. It further brings me back to the thinking of Baldwin and King and Gandhi even, and with the theory of nonviolence. It's really interesting. At that time, the state had a much higher state of legitimacy and moral authority to the broader population of white Americans, with the greatest exception of Black people. And without using force, the theory of nonviolence, which is really a love for white people, was a love that they didn't have completely in themselves. Was a way to really say the state does not have.
Still want to get your phone. Okay. I'm sorry.
That's cool. Was really a way to demonstrate to the world, because you didn't need to win everybody over, but you could say the state does not have the moral authority to rule and govern over me based off of how it treats me and what it has done to me, and even what it has done to the world. And with the love that you were applying in force, you say that we actually have a greater moral authority, and we have the right and the capacity to determine our destiny and even govern. And so the struggle that was waged then is in a certain way uncompleted and unfulfilled. And yet I think a similar responsibility, I feel, falls upon the people in this time. I don't expect Trump to be the moral center in the Republican Party, although they have a part to play in this time as well. I don't think we can expect that to be the place where a moral centering and the moral authority of the state is achieved. I do place it firmly on the people.
I'm sorry. I was looking at Alice moving. See, you raised this question of the moral center, and here's where Trump has abdicated completely. And that's why Scott Ritter would say either he's a liar or ignorant or something. And I mean, there's a case to be made at this point. And he is going to have to rectify this sense of him. However, beyond him is still this crisis of the state. It's a crisis of rule. And he might, and his people, some of his people might be aware of it, but awareness of it and knowing what to do about it are two different things. But I'm sorry, I don't want to talk to you. Go ahead.
Well, it took me a while to process your introduction, actually, because I was trying to figure out why. Because I think the question of the state is really difficult.
Yes, no, it is. It really is.
And kind of like what Eddie and Nathan were saying, with the moral, like why the moral is so important, and then its kind of connections with the people's role, is that like the way I was thinking through was also how you talked about the difference between the Marxian way of understanding the state.
Yes.
Like basically like the Marx, well, first of all, I think most people today would not question, for example, even if they understand, like I think most people to a certain degree understand that there is the existence of the state, like something permanent, whether they call it the state or not. But I think people do not question. It's interesting that a lot of people, for example, would not think that the legitimacy of the state comes from a moral legitimacy. Like it goes back to the whole like it's economic stupid thing, where people, I think a lot of people would not, because essentially I think a claim we're making is that the connection between the people and the state, like whether it's America or China, is that it's immoral. It requires a moral or civilization or ideological basis. Like that in some ways that there is no, I would say like there is no social contract without a moral contract. I don't know if that's weird to say, but because the Marxian understanding of the state is that the state always is illegitimate because the state protects the capitalist class. Like the state is that the state is like a brute force, which is why like I think Marxism has the belief that the end goal is for there no longer a state, for there no longer to even be a state.
Right.
Whereas some of what we're getting at is like that there is the legitimacy of the state or the legitimacy of the ruling elite comes from like a moral legitimacy.
Yes, and what I was trying to establish is that even if it were true in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, the modern bourgeois state, especially the American state, is a far more complex set of functions and proceeds in a more complex way than just as a blunt instrument of class rule, class terror. Because, I'm sorry.
Well, that's also, I'm kind of sad that Ren and Hikmat left, because actually part of the reason why culture becomes important is because culture is ideology. Culture and art are ideology, and it's a mistake to assume it's disconnected from the state. Like not just art and culture, but also like art, culture, and the institutions themselves, nonprofits, schools, institutions, universities. And if you don't understand that, then you like basically the American people are, especially youth, are susceptible to all the ways that not just assassinate king literally by blood, but like assassinate king in what is our inheritance, a set of ideas, which is our revolutionary inheritance through other forms. Because like I think I read the David Brooks article that you were talking about, where something David Brooks says is he was like, the best way he would talk about like the MAGA movement is he says it's not really about Trump versus not Trump. It's about, are you are you an institutionalist
Yes.
or are you an anti-institutionalist?
Right.
Right, which is in some ways a more sophisticated
Yeah.
analysis than just saying it's about fascists versus like people who support.
Or about preserving the institution, i.e. the state.
Yes.
Making it better, improving it. That's what Brooks is arguing.
Yeah.
And that the MAGA movement has utter contempt for all of that and wants to tear it down.
Right.
Which might be a kind of an overreach for him to say that.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think I'm trying to remember why this came up, but I think what you were saying about King, I think is important, where you basically helped explain the reason why the King was basically like King was such a force. Someone like King is such a force that the state, the liberal state itself, must account for him. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. So like
That's right.
basically the liberal state can't just leave him in the dust because he doesn't
be unmindful.
right. Because he's
Yes,
such a
I'm
man
sorry.
of history.
Of
So
its-
yes, that in some ways it is because
Yes.
you also made this point later, which is like, was it the Germans? Was it the Germans who believed that the state like reflects the epoch?
Yeah, that's Hegel.
Oh, sorry, Hegel. Like Hegel would say, like, because Hegel is not like Marx, right? Marx goes into the realm of saying the state is a blunt force, like, but Hegel would say the state is the state of civilization. To a certain degree, Hegel like allows you to go forth and say that the state is civilizational and that the state is reflective of the epoch. And so King is such a force, or like he's a man of history or a man of destiny, because in some ways King is a reflection, like what King stood for, the values he like was putting forth, his vision is reflective of a new state which would define the epoch.
Absolutely.
Which is why the liberal or the old dying state must account for King and appropriate him.
Absolutely.
So
And that's the complicated move they had to make. It took a lot of academic and intellectual thinking to really know how to do it, how they would make the move to account for King and the civil rights movement, and thus to appropriate his thinking. Yeah, I'm sorry.
no.
Yeah, I think. Oh,
No.
and therefore I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Emily. No, you go.
No, you go.
Okay, but the more you think about it, and because I kind of lived through it, I saw it, and you saw, and so you have at the end of the day this King statue monument in Washington D.C. A monument to not the man that's supposed to be a monument to.
Yeah.
And then which one?
The hug.
Is that in
No,
Boston?
it's in Boston. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, in DC.
Yeah.
Look at that.
So how can you say, that we're racist? Look what we're doing. You have a holiday and yada, yada, yada. But it is the content. And this is why I was just saying to Corba, for us, there cannot be a retreat on any grounds from the ideological struggle.
Right.
It just can't. I mean, we would have no reason. Why would we be here today except for the fact that we feel this urgency to know, to explain this crisis, and thank God there are people like you all, and I guess I'm a part of it, who are prepared to sacrifice a lot in order to know, and in knowing to help others to know and to hopefully bring about change.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? No, it's very, very important. This is life and death, man.
Yeah.
Everything that comes down the pike we have to know, you know? I was saying to Kathy, I asked Kathy, I said, look, man, you know, 2025, if we can do a thing on, you know, Ellington, Charlie Mingus, and Sun Ra, these great composers, you know, as a way of knowing the capacity of the people.
Yeah.
If they can produce this art, if they can produce this, you know, if they can do this, not no, you know, bullshit all the time. Why do we black folk always have to be this spectacle? It is really creative. It is real. I don't know how you cut it. And so I was saying, you know, we have to further this dealing with the ideological and moral crisis of the ruling class, this alternative. It, you know, yeah, they find it easy to promote hip hop, Snoop Dogg,
Yeah.
you know, Megan Thee Stallion, and all that. You know, even Rakim and so and so. But that as a substitute for all this great, and it is great, it is extraordinary. But I feel, and it is, see, what a lot of people don't understand, they don't understand the map upon which y'all fight.
Yeah.
Because they don't know about fight, they don't know about the struggle. You know what I'm saying?
Well, not even hip hop, but even just take something like K-pop.
K-pop.
Yeah, take something like K-pop, which is like it's essentially it's an expression. It is a deliberate ideological tool created by the state to distract the young generation from ever finding their brothers and sisters in North Korea. It's why, for example, whether you take Cuba or North Korea, the number one thing they did is they banned culture from other countries. Why? Because it's an excellent tool. Like it's an excellent tool, it's an excellent ideological tool of the state. But I guess back to the moral, moral legitimacy is, well, two things is one is I think it was clarifying. It's clarifying because the whole origin story of the US is, it's not really, when people think of ideology, I think they think of like just floating ideas, but essentially a way of explaining the origin story of America, like you were saying, Doc, is that we already have a myth of, we already have a moral, in some ways, the moral legitimacy of the American state is that it's a liberal democracy. Like that's a moral, like it's why America.
The word liberal means progressive to a lot
Right,
of people,
which is why King would always critique America as the moral policeman of the world.
right.
And the second thing I want to say was like back to King and revolutionary values is it's so timely, but also it's timely, devastating, and like urgent today to talk about the crisis of the state as like the crisis of the state, because this election, more than like ever before, shows that the people have rejected a moral legitimacy that has given the ruling elite,
There is no two ways about it.
basically power. Like it is the people who give power and meaning to to the government and the consensus that rules the state. Like I feel like that's something that people forget, or I feel like it's just not something made clear. But it was King who was like, it kind of makes some of King's wording deep, where he says, like, we Black people are going to inject meaning into American civilization. Like this whole thing of like, Baldwin would say, we haven't even achieved our country yet. You could exchange country for the word state. We have yet to achieve a national state. Like we have yet to achieve a civilizational state. Like right? Like, and then King would say like,
but that's but you know, wouldn't you say that all states are civilizational?
yeah.
Okay.
Which is
The question is
what
civilization?
on what values? Yeah, because there's that
yeah.
article. This article you had sent me, I forget. It was from March. It was that guy. I forget his name. Some guy who was basically like, the Americans are fucked because
The what?
Americans are fucked because kids who go to university don't know how to do anything like real. All they know how to do is become lawyers and move money around.
Right.
He said they're like, you were like, oh, check out the second to last paragraph where the sentence basically said that there is no such thing as national values in America. There's only partisan values.
Oh, Emmanuel Todd.
I don't know.
I think that I sent that to you recently, didn't I?
Yeah, it's basically you're pointing out that like that basically every state is a civilizational state, but the crisis of the American state is that the American people in some ways have rejected the foundation upon which like people even understand.
Oh, this
Western
the pathetic academic now foresees the West defeat.
Yeah.
That's the one. Hold, let me
You said the call. What?
call. Let me see how many. Yeah, I think that's it. Hold on. Let me just get the. Yeah. At times, it seems there are no national principles, only partisan ones, with each side convinced that the other is trying not just to run the government, but also to capture the state. That's to capture the state, which means it's a struggle for state power.
Yeah. Right. And I guess the real point I was just trying to make is that the way you defined, Doc, that today, basically the times we're living in today is that unfortunately due to this great counter-revolution after the civil rights movement, where even something like the university is not a neutral bystander, but the university in fact is the number one instrument in reproducing the state, because you're also producing young people who all they know how to do is essentially assimilate to or be part of or uphold the state, or just be depressed and die. But is that it's like today what we have today, it must be the people who take power. But part of the problem and the reason why free school is so attached to raising King back up is because, and the Black freedom struggle up, is that the American people must also believe in their own capacity. Like, it is a time where the American people need to know their capacity to govern and to take state power. And like King said, inject meaning into civilization. Like assert what a modern civilization state in quote unquote so-called America must look like. And that's why the Third American Revolution and King are so important. Like those ideas. And I guess the thing I just want to say is sometimes I do get sad that, well, it's been 60 years since the Black freedom struggle, and in Chinese terms, that would be like two generations. And I remember Mao said this thing where he was like, it's the second, but most importantly, the third generation that like is the weakest one, because in 3 generations you lose sight of the revolution. And I think this time is really important because I think, the people who literally lived through the civil rights movement will pass away in like maybe 40 years, 20 to 40 years. And like, that's why this ideological battle it's literally life and death.
Absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right. And, so much of what we do, we always put to reclaim. Remember the 10th annual knowledge and reclaiming the revolutionary spirit,
No, I mean, I think because when Emily told me about this thing this morning, I was like, okay. I was like, it is kind of sad, right? That a generation that has witnessed a revolution are no longer, like in the future, are no longer around to share that experience in history. But I actually think in this conversation, Doc, earlier, what you had mentioned about Kant and how you know through your senses, and how actually that's different from knowing through reason, and that you can also know the truth beyond your senses, what you see, what you hear, what you experience. And I didn't realize actually how consequential that philosophical differences, because if the argument is that you can only know the truth through experience, then maybe we don't have hope for the future.
Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, like,
Mhm.
and of course, it's valuable that you have those who have experienced a revolution to share that experience and share, you know, those heroes and figures. But
Yes.
but actually, to build on, like, that's valuable, but at the same time, we can still know.
Yes.
And even though we may not be part of that generation that has seen it, through, as human beings and through reason, we're able to get to the truth and the truth of that time and the truth of the struggle. And in that also reclaim and reignite that time.
You can.
And
See, that's the question. Can we know?
yeah.
Can we know? And what can we know? And I mean, I have to say, Alice, you hit on something so very important. And that's another feature of the British continental European split. We can only know that which we experience, which is another way of saying we can only know things in their phenomenal form as phenomenon of the senses and so on. Now, Kant tried to make a compromise between European rationalism and British empiricism. And what he said is that, well, we can't know things in their essence, but by reason, we can know more about the phenomena that we experience. And Hegel said, well, we might not know everything in the immediate sense, but over historical time, we will know. I think what you are saying, what you're saying is so very valuable and important. And it's so much like Martin Luther King. You know, if it, you know, I mean, I feel that Black people, we should be embraced, we should be critiqued, we should anything. I mean, we ain't above history. You understand what I'm saying? And anybody that criticized Black misleadership class, I'm down with. You know, we once we mounted the stage of history and tried to change this country, we then become part of humanity's struggle, and humanity has to look at us. And they have a right. Humanity should look at, and yeah, but I agree with you. And this is one of the great struggles. What can we know? What can we know? And I think what we do here is to try to know more. You know, critical investigation, discourse, dialogue, to know more in order to be more capable of making change. You know, just, can I just say one thing? You know, just like, you know, I know back in my days, I'm in the Communist Party, we just accepted the Marxian notion of the state. The state is a blunt force.
Yeah, interesting.
Are we missing the whole thing? What about the state as a civilizational force, as a moral force, as an ideological
Determined by
force?
the people.
Right.
Determined and shaped by the people.
Yes, yes. In that struggle with the ruling elites. So it's, you know, and frankly, we couldn't explain very much if the struggle is to seize the state. And, well, what if you can't seize the state? Then what do you do? That's what Grace Lee Boggs faced when she stepped back and said, wait a minute, hold it.
Right.
King, you know?
Right.
Yeah, King.
Maybe we could look at some of the chat.
Okay. Can I say something?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I feel like what was so valuable.
Oh, yes. Well, this is actually something I did find just as clarifying that I think I hadn't really considered, or we've talked about it, but I took it kind of for granted until you made it clear. It was also the distinction between when you reduce something like the state to something like an instrument to repress, or like a blunt weapon to repress a people, and therefore your whole struggle is to mount against and take up those tactics of like, maybe we will beat it back, also something with a blunt strategy. But instead you clarified that actually it's actually one, is that that's no longer the nature of the state today,
the soul nature
of the state today, and therefore to even engage the state on the level that it is operating, the ideological, the strategic, the maneuvering, the intricacies, we have to be just as sharp, just as precise, and just as strategic, and on the edge of the ideological battle. And that actually opens up the capacity for the people to all engage, rather than just the people who can take up either a violent struggle or like some kind of struggle just based on force alone. I think that's what Baldwin means when he talks about, when he searches for a majority, it's really a moral majority that you can engage in an ideological struggle. It's the basis of what we've been saying in the civil rights movement, or King as well. But one thing that I think also came to mind in the discussion around, that came up around hip hop and critique, and should this kind of critique come up from within the Black community? It gave me solely, and it gave me a lot to think about, because if Ren and Hikam were here, I think the question, I mean, I would have a lot of questions to actually bring up that I'm only now coalescing in my mind, which is I think connected to what you were trying to say in terms of if we retreat from even critique itself, I think that ignores the question altogether of why we're even raising it in the first place. It's close to what you were saying, Emily, which is like, now is a time in which like everything is used, including culture, is being used against the people. So shouldn't all people be able to say, these are the weapons of which we are being used, that we are being attacked by? And I don't think that's being necessarily anti-Black, because that obscures the nature of hip hop altogether, a tool of white supremacy. Like thinking about all of these record executives, many of them are white, and that are like making so much money off of Black people. Is that a position that we think Black people should be put within? And then also, what is that nature of people who have sold out and do not believe that they have a role to play other than subscribing to this, like Black, but also any kind of people who ought to be taking up a revolutionary struggle, but see more opportunity in selling out in many ways. I don't feel as if that is a thing that we can. I feel like that it's a very hard thing to disagree with, but I mean, I might be wrong. But I think it also is a question of, I think this is why I think that being precise on like white supremacy, and also how evolved the ideological struggle has become. And it is far more sophisticated than I think. It just requires so much more of all of us, and I think something that I used to think was something really obvious, but Baldwin would state in different essays, and I'm thinking a lot actually about the essay "What Price Freedom" and in this, because it's one of the places where he says like, actually, this is America. I'm just gonna pull it up, but I've been trying to read it and think about it in conversation with this discussion. But it's that America is this strange phenomenon where this country, I'm just going to quote from it. This country, in terms of its politicians, always seem to feel that things are out of our hands, that we can't do anything, which is a country that has no objective need to do so, to do anything, will always talk about the lesser of two evils. But actually, why is it that a country that that I think promotes this idea, or like its citizens feel, or its politicians feel that like things are just the way that they are, like we don't know how the state functions, things will always be this way, like, can we do anything to change this country? Baldwin's like, no, the state, like, actually, this is precisely what they want us to believe, or even this is actually precisely, like, you have to recognize that a state is made up of people, and that actually we are responsible. Like, that's the conundrum, where actually it is important to remember that unlike, you know, the formulation of the state being this abstract weapon of like beating back a class, like we do make up a state. We are responsible to the state, and we are responsible as citizens to it. And I want to like find other essays where he says this, because I think this helps us. I think Baldwin is helping us see the nature of the struggle in the same way that needs to be. That's what you were saying, which is like Baldwin's epistemology can apply to our time today even better or more sharply, because this is something that I think that's why we're talking about it now in the wake of the election, and also as so many people are reeling to understand what took place, and especially even all these pundits and thinkers of the ruling elite. There's increasingly a question of the capacity of the people. And I think this is why understanding this nature, what exactly is the state, and what exactly, it just cannot be, it cannot be that like Americans, you know, give up their capacity to, you know, and the responsibility to creating a new state, essentially, or challenging the state.
And the moral responsibility to critique.
Yes.
And there is no iron curtain saying that Black people are the only ones able to critique other Black people. No.
But that's the thing.
Because suppose Black thinkers don't rise to the moral responsibility, then what? You know, but I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to give the example of, say, how mad you are about what happened in Bangladesh, and your anger is directed towards Modi and Jaishankar. And you have every right to say that, no, I grew up, I came up when Indira Gandhi was towering over, you know, Indian politics and the Indian state, and to see what these Indians are, you know, in power are doing right now, I have to say, you've dropped the ball. You've done something that you've dropped the ball. You used to have a place in the world, and you're dropping the ball. And that's very important. It's very important. If Indian intellectuals, like, you know, if they are not capable of doing it, it should come from anywhere, any position of anybody who is in love with what India represented in the world, who respects. That's the thing, you know, I love and respect my mother, right? If somebody misrepresents her, I am going to fight back, you know. It's a labor of love to say what you're doing with hip hop is a misrepresentation of Black people.
Right.
You know, you're basically the intent of this is to take people away from that triumphant music that came out of the Black freedom movement, and now you're exporting it everywhere else. And this is becoming the legacy of Black people. No, it's unacceptable. You know, sorry, I got excited.
No, I was gonna let it go, but it appears, because, you know, I'm going to say what Purpose said from my perspective, which is I didn't grow up in India. I didn't grow up with Gandhi. You know, what does Gandhi mean to someone like me? I didn't experience, you know, poverty in India. I haven't experienced, you know, violence. You know, maybe if you want to be. But, you know, it would be essential if the king said, "Oh no, I can't appropriate satyagraha. That's an Indian thing." You know, how ridiculous would that be? You know, but the fact of the matter is that he did, you know, incorporate, you know, Indian philosophy into his philosophy, and thereby affirming its universality. And maybe there's more I can draw out of this, but you can say the same thing about music. Is Black music universal or not? Does it have something to say to the human being or not? Or does Gandhi have something to say to the human being or not? What is the test? Can you put his theory into practice in a different continent, in a different time, and thereby King, I can't be reunited with my civilization without King's move to Gandhi. And without that, that's the strength of the Black freedom struggle.
Well, no one has problems, because no one has problems appropriating Marx, for example. No one has problems even turning the International in 100 languages. And I kind of dig the International for the record. But what Kathy was saying about what Kathy was saying is I forget what you said, but I had this thought from you, which is, the whole idea is that the whole idea of the future of America as a new nation or a new civilization is the belief that everything that is intertwined or produced by whiteness, white supremacy, should actually not only be shed, but we claim that it has corrupted the very human essence that must produce civilization, right? It's the belief that we believe, it's what you're saying, Doc, the epistemology, I guess what you're saying, Kathy, that Baldwin's epistemology is based on the belief that whiteness undermines civilization and democracy themselves. Which is why, our claim is not that the white proletariat is universal. Our claim is that the Black proletariat and the struggle that the Black proletariat clarifies and is engaged in should be the whole proletariat, the whole American people's struggle. And the question is, okay, well, what definition of freedom and civilization do you want the future of American civilization to be on? Our belief is that, this is why someone like Du Bois was so upset with Booker T. Washington. He was you're telling me that the best that Black people can contribute is their manual labor.
Right.
Whereas Du Bois literally was I believe, and this is the 1880s, literally in the shadow of the defeat of Reconstruction, literally in the shadow of slavery. Here you have someone like Du Bois, where Black people at that point, have just experienced emancipation, where you have someone like Du Bois saying, I actually believe that in the grand scheme of things, the grand story of humanity, it is actually the Negro, the African American, who is the agent of democracy, who can show the way for all the other people who don't even realize they're imprisoned by white supremacy. It's him being I think actually it is the Black proletariat, is the African American people who have maintained onto something universal, humanity, that human essence, which has not yet been corrupted by white supremacy. If we can carry that spirit forward and advance it, then we can bring the whole American people to modernity. And that's, and I think that's also why, speaking of the counter-revolution of the civil rights movement, I think that's why you get so many different forms of ideologies, identity politics, modernism, queer theory. A lot of people would say they're different from each other, but actually their function is not that different from intersectionality, even you could say identity politics, it's all different. They all have somewhat the same function, which is to believe, which is to say that the Black experience, yes, it's particular, but it shows something universal. All people should see the universality, of that. Basically, what has happened to African American people in this country says something universal about the system we all live in.
Isn't that the whole point of the postmodernism? And I feel you all completely when you say, but this is my generation. Where are they going? And I feel you completely. I know you said it to me, Emily. The thing that hurts you most is that postmodernism has so captured educated young people and Black people in particular, that everything is argued from that standpoint and not even knowing what the standpoint is.
Right. Or let's even take like let's even take people who literally should be the most like me, right? But make different choices. Let's just take Asian Americans, Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans, why is it that Chinese Americans are more ready to accept the white experience as their experience, the white standards of success and happiness as theirs, but are deliberately kept from Black people because so that they don't see actually the standards that I want to live by, definitions of happiness, success, freedom. Like, why is it that you're so ready to accept the white, but you're in many different ways from all sides encouraged not to know Black people, not to care about Black people, and then also not look to Black people as the standards that's produced by the Black community or the standards that are even found in Du Bois or King or Baldwin as your own. Like, that is a deliberate move.
Yeah.
Like, white is encouraged as the universal.
Right. Yes.
And like the whole point is, I mean, it's not just Asians, but all people. And to a certain
No, it's not
extent,
just Asian, believe me.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm just, no. I'm sorry. Go ahead, man.
I wanted to, what something someone said, and also what Alice said about, can we even know?
Yes,
And
yes.
it reminds me, there's an essay by Adolf Reed, maybe an article, and he talks about this, the retreat from ideology, how the ideological struggle has been lost, so the modern day left rejects ideology. And so that's why you get many people in the street who are all about work,
Yeah.
I'm doing the work. What are you doing? Because we've heard it a lot.
Yeah, right.
We're not doing anything.
We're not doing it.
Just sitting and talking.
Yeah, we're just sitting and talking. Oh, we're academics in a vacuum. Shit, I forgot.
Take your time.
So this whole thing of the role that postmodernism plays in and it's not just explicit postmodernism, but it can be nihilism and postmodernism in other forms, like for rap, nothing matters but just guns and bitches,
Get drugs.
This is what and drugs, or just drugs in general, just doing drugs and that subculture. And and it's this nothing matters, but you see it in multiple forms. You see it in all the forms. It could be the white left, oh well, we can't do education because people are just struggling to survive. Or you could see it with rap, and by the way, this is a good faith critique. That my life doesn't matter, all what's the saying? You only live once, YOLO. Or I'm trying to think of all the other examples. But it's a retreat. It's a retreat. You are the one in full, white flag retreat. It's what Kathy said, non-struggle. But it takes what I want to point out is it takes so many different forms. You're attacked from all angles. It's the music, it's the culture. You could even go into a subculture and you would still find it.
I don't know how your generation is surviving it all.
Yeah.
I mean, it is overwhelming. It's like an airtight situation.
You could even be in a small sect in the left, and you in a reading group. This is sort of autobiographical. You could be in a reading group. You could be in doing all this work on the streets and political activism, this and that, and going to public meetings and everything, and you could still be in the non-struggle.
Yeah. Yes.
If you don't know how to identify.
Yeah.
This whole discussion also further helped me advance what I was thinking about more about the place of nonviolence in the struggle to overcome the crisis of the state.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, wow.
Yeah. Interesting.
In considering, for example, the use of force and only challenging the state on that basis,
Yes.
and you just had the power of blunt force, you would not be seizing or really challenging the whole basis of the state. You wouldn't have not just like the moral authority. You wouldn't by just challenging on the basis of force, you wouldn't necessarily capture the moral authority, and you wouldn't be challenging in all its dimensions, even the economic foundations of the state and the relationship of the people. With the power of nonviolence, you say all people make up the state. Everyone has a part to play. Every person's decision on how they relate to each other and the whole of society
Can I
is.
ask, you say all people make up the state.
Mhm.
Why would you say that? If I could just say why I'm asking, because I think the state is a specific institution of society.
So let me take, for example, people in the Montgomery bus boycott.
Yeah.
And you say that these institutions of the state do not reflect who I am, and I remove my participation, I remove my consent,
Right.
and all of a sudden you have these institutions that have certain blunt power. They still have the force, and yet you have a Southern Christian Leadership Conference that is actually assuming a certain role, really governing even. Like I remember reading, this became the basis of the Southern Leadership Conference, for example, the organization that made an alternative to bus routes in Montgomery. You have all these literacy campaigns in the South. We take the education of the human being into the hands and the decision of the people, into the realm of the people's decisions. And so, I mean, me, the single individual, does not make up the state, but I am a part of it in a non-substantial way. I mean, in a very substantial way.
Yeah.
And my decision to not go along with it can actually topple it over even. And
Absolutely. That's right. This is a very, withdraw your legitimacy, withdraw your, yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
And
And hence bring the state down.
Yes.
Can I expand on Eddie's?
No,
I get really distracted usually when I get into so no, I lost it. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me.
Just real quickly, for non-violence, I was thinking of, I think it's Thoreau in his civil disobedience, where it's sort of to what Eddie's speaking about, where he's saying, I'm not going to pay the poll tax for this imperialist war. And, for nonviolence, the fundamental basis of nonviolence is you have to believe in something. So the transcendentalists, they believe that, humans could overcome. Or, Gandhi, he did believe in truth, my experience with the truth. Or Martin Luther King, he says, in his pilgrimage to nonviolence, I explored all these ideologies, including Marxism, but it didn't have, the Christ. The fundamental basis of nonviolence, you have to believe in something. With nihilism, you don't believe in anything.
Actually,
It just got back to me. In terms of like new values of the state, the basis on which it's founded, not just power, but the morals and values that come out of it. I think it's useful to have the power of force, or even which can protect you from a worse force. But I mean, I'll take what James Lawson's assessment of Cuba as the greatest nonviolent struggle that he had the pleasure of knowing about in modern history, because through once there was like state power, a new basis on which a state would be founded came out of the relationship of the people to each other and the people in the state. And so without that, assuming you just have the blunt force, then there's no, what is to say that you have any new values and the institutions take on any new character.
No, you're right.
Well, this dovetails with what I was thinking a little bit, because I feel like when you asked the question of how do the people make up the state, I was also thinking about questions of people's governance or governance, which I think is different than like, I think the specific iteration of the state that you were talking about, that's like 20 million people and like bureaucracy, which I'm still, actually I don't really know how that all fits together, but we can save that aside. But what I was thinking about also had to do with James Lawson, because while I wasn't here for it, I was told that in a discussion when James Lawson had visited in 2019, there was a discussion at your house and that was interviewed, and Roger had asked this question of, does nonviolence have a theory of the state? And I think we were saying that like we weren't sure at the time, but clearly there's like a lot on the table, like
He said, we do not have a theory of the
but I
state.
feel like we're getting somewhere.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, that was very interesting, because he acknowledged his understanding of the problem. You know, if Marxism said that it's only the violent seizure of power, then how would nonviolent theory respond to that? And he said, I don't think we have an adequate way to respond to it at this point. You know, it was mercy, man.
We're making progress.
Okay, I'm gonna pull in some comments.
Okay.
So I'll go from the beginning chronologically. So our friends Todd, Doherty, Kansas Mama, Bambalai all say good morning. And there's diverse weather. Kansas City has snow, and New Mexico has sun.
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
You missed it. You snooze, you lose.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's not important, don't worry. Bumbleye says, looks like the heater's broken in the church. It is a little cold, but I don't know. Very observant of you, Bumbleye. Shantanu also is saying, good morning, looking forward to the conversation. We miss you, our dear brother. Fireplay also is tapping in, says, good morning, all. M. Sparks also says, good morning. Everyone's trying to stay warm. Okay, blah, 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 going down. Our dear brother. Fireplay also.
It's too shouted.
Okay, Matt says, Enlightenment thinkers did not have archaeological evidence or a more complete anthropological picture that has emerged since. Their view of prehistory was based on their imagination. I think this was in response to your when you were talking about the Anglo-Saxon. Okay, Shanti says protection of the rights of the individual rather than investment in the lives of the individual by the state encourages the freedom from society approach rather than freedom to change society. M. Spark says illegitimate Aryan barbaric colonies posing as states, countries, and/or nations. No chance of a moral state practicing morality. Matt says Doctors Jared Ball and Todd Stephen Burrows have had some great discussions about MLK on Black liberation media. Interesting. Okay, Shantanu says it's very revealing that in a recent press briefing, U.S. officials, when asked what is the difference between an offensive and defensive strike with respect to Russia and Ukraine, they said a defensive strike is one launched by the U.S. and its allies, and an offensive strike is one launched by the enemies of the U.S. and its allies. The same rules-based order they have pretended to uphold all these years is collapsing on itself. Tom McTeague says, it's kind of tough realizing that you are actually part of the Anglo-Roman Catholic Empire. Rest in peace, Aaron Bushnell.
Yeah.
Bumbleye, oh yeah, okay. Okay. Bumbleye asks, whose money is killing children in Palestine? Kansas Mama says, I understand that Hillary violated the same laws when she paid for the Steele dossier with a lawyer expense to sway an election instead of campaign expense. No felony for her, $113,000 fine. I think that's in response to Trump, I forget which part this was response to. Okay. That's kind of why we don't care about Trump's convictions. They aren't justified. Yeah, so that was her response. But Hillary's also, there's a different treatment towards Trump versus Hillary, which kind of goes along with what we said last week, which is because the state understands Trump as a threat to itself. Hey, we haven't gotten there yet. Okay, Bombay says the goal is to change all regimes across the globe to suit the empire. M. Sparks, blah, blah. Okay, skipping. Robert says the election was rigged. Bombay says the moral authority has also betrayed the world. That is the kicker. Where in the world are Biden and Harris? Hiding in a closet? Okay, BK says hip hop was co-opted and commercialized by the ruling class to serve the intentions of the ruling class, just like most other movements and art forms that have momentum. Matt says, interested in the elaboration of a revolutionary theory by Free School. Kansas Mama says, there's something with the music industry. The rabbit hole is deep around MK Ultra and the music industry, Laurel Canyon and the children of the CIA being in top bands.
I don't quite understand. So,
there's something with the music industry. The rabbit hole is deep around MK Ultra. And the music industry, Laurel Canyon, and the children of the CIA being in top bands. Interesting.
Well, it's not just Laurel Hill. There was the lead singer of the Doors. His father was a Navy admiral in Vietnam. Very high up. A lot of Hollywood is a closed off industry. And this is the topic of Nepo babies, meaning your family was Nepo baby, where your family was involved. But it seems like there's a lot of connection to the State Department and military in Hollywood.
Yeah, right. BK says hip hop is product of the environment in its time, just like jazz at its time.
I don't agree.
Okay. Samir does not agree with that. Bumbless as Miles Davis, bitches. M. Sparks says most Black Americans are lost in the sauce and have drank the poisonous Anglo Kool-Aid and adopted their evil, soulless Neanderthal, barbarian, diabolical, unsavory ways. BK says hip hop can be seen as a lower artistic expression relative to jazz music. There's a question: what is Black culture? Good question. What is Black? What is produced by Black people versus what is produced by the state? In the name of Black people. Okay, BK, but jazz is a lower artistic expression relative to earlier Black musical expressions. Famle says the art is in the expression of feeling in a song. In the rim bones of the universe, there lies feelings, big feelings, put that into music. That is the art. Okay, well, maybe we can talk about the theory of art another time. Manifesto says common expressions of artistic interpretation practiced by colonized Africans in America. Okay, Kansas Mama, this is a response when we're talking about critiquing hip hop. Who is allowed to critique culture, Black culture or not? Kansas Mama says, why can't he talk about hip hop in the 80s? Weren't Beastie Boys hip hop and not Black? Are they not allowed to talk about hip hop in the 80s? Okay. Bambla says different cultures have different ways of expressing themselves. Manifesto says anyone can talk about anything. What makes one an authority is the study, understanding, invested. Maeve Vertigal says once the white students entered the meetings of already fractured Panther Party, those foundations disintegrated. Okay, I'm gonna skip some of these because culture, blah blah blah, culture, blah blah blah, shared experience, blah blah blah. Blah, 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 for example, jazz is okay. Yes, great. I'm glad Chad's talking about music. Okay. Okay, yeah. So Maeve added in their thoughts, which is to the point that they even believe folk or country, it always belonged to them. Okay, the literal whitewashing of Black history has made white people unconsciously own and claim Black art, Black culture. Malcolm and Fred Hampton is this moment, in my opinion. Okay, she says, I'm to the point of full-on John Brown, and I need it. Okay, BK says, all immigrants have the potential to understand and speak about the Black American experience. They just have to live amongst and learn from Black Americans. Cultural pride, arrogance, and the rabid pursuit of the American dream gets in the way for many of them. and I understand the immigrant perspective. Maeve says, beware the white moderate. Okay. Bumbleye says, within the internet, many will manipulate culture. Maeve says, Palestine is the epicenter and the time is now. King and Malcolm already told us this as well. The value from the culture isn't Beyonce, it's the Bayhive. Okay. Okay, Mem Spark says, all I know is the struggle against white supremacy has gone in for way too damn long. Okay, all these. Okay. Okay, Fireplay. I'm a bit behind. The way those two folks left made me think they were infiltrators, whether or not they were. That was fascinating. I've seen their argument in the academy and nonprofit sector a lot. Had I doc skills, perhaps I would have navigated such spaces in a smoother fashion before ejected from them. Okay, well, thanks for all your comments. Yeah.
I don't know whether we want to get ready to go. It's kind of cold in here.
Hey, I have some concluding thoughts.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Can I say? Yes. First of all, I wanted to say that the people who were here are from the from Philly Reed's Baldwin, one of the reading groups. So they were anyway. That's why they were here. The other thing that I wanted to say, just because I feel like this has been started today. I don't want to forget this thought I had was when Doc, you were first talking about where you were talking about the origin myth of America. I just wanted to point out that that's a very different formulation than what the settler colonial theorists people say. And I the reason why I'm saying it is because this question came to my mind is how would we argue that it's different? But it is different because it's not talking about the revolutionary process as being fundamentally irredeemable. What it's saying is you're lying about some of the fundamental or foundational contradictions in the way the American state or the social contract is even thought about today, which is that you ignored the part that it was white supremacist. But it does not say that there cannot be a revolutionary process that ultimately reverts that and makes a state of the whole people possible. So that's something that came to my mind because I feel like this is conflated a lot. Everything is irredeemable and
but that's that's so true. I'm sorry.
No, that and the other thing is this is just an open question that I don't know the answer to, but I want to think about more is how Baldwin sees the state, because some of the stuff, like I was bringing up that essay, he talks about the relationship between the state and society. But I have the feeling that his emphasis is always on the people, but he's like, people, you do not give up your moral authority to basically pressure the state to be what it needs to be. And he calls it many different things. He says the anonymity of the state, or he says the republic, and I always got the sense, and I could be wrong, I just would like to work it out. I always got the sense that to him, and because he's talking in the American context and as the voice of a black people or a black proletariat, to him the state has had negative value. Like I don't know if he considers the state to be able to even become a moral force.
I don't know. I really don't know. See, I think those questions you then have to go to King.
I see. Yes, that's what I was going to say next is King, on the other hand, goes to that question of the social contract and outlines what can be a just social contract and so on. But these are just some questions I have that I don't fully know the right answer.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to keep working on these ideas. And I recommend to everyone that, the New York Times opinion page has put stuff out. Whenever I run across something, I'll text it to somebody and then we could, text it to everybody. But I think David Brooks, Rawls do that. and some others are worth paying attention to because they're prepared to, deal with the enormity of the crisis.
Okay, well, that was a good Thanksgiving preschool, and we'll see you in the chat next week for all of our chatters.
And can we tell the commenters to include the context in their comment next time?
Oh yeah, it'd be helpful. In the chat, it'd be helpful if you say what you're responding to.
Yeah,
Unless it's obvious.
yeah.
Sometimes it's hard for us to know, especially without Nuri around. She's really good at that.
She keeps track.
Yeah, she keeps track. Okay, happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, we're thankful for y'all joining us.
Yeah.